Hello my crafty friends and welcome back to my channel. I'm so happy you stopped by. In this video I'm sharing 3 more card ideas and techniques using the scrapbook.com gloss pops of color. These new gloss pops of color have a beautiful shine to them and are a perfect accent to add to any card project. On this first card, I was inspired by a card I made a couple of years ago. I came across it and was inspired to recreate it with some new products, including the scrapbook.com pops of color. To get started, I die cut some butterflies and sprigs from Distress Heavy Stock. I applied some mint tape to the back side of the butterfly bodies and the sprigs. I then began applying the ink to each piece. Here I'm using Distress Oxides in Salvage Patina, Milled Lavender, and Saltwater Taffy. I'm using that little scrap of paper to hold the die cut and to keep my fingers from lifting the ink before it is dry. I'm cleaning up my craft mat in between each color, but I'm not going to make you watch me do that. After I finished inking the butterflies, I dried them using my heat tool. Before starting the next step, it's very important that the ink is dry. Of course, you don't have to ink the paper. You could also just use colored cardstock if you prefer. Next, I'm going to do some heat embossing using the Tim Holtz Tapestry Stamp Set with my MISTI. Here I'm applying scrapbook.com dotted adhesive roller, which is a repositional adhesive, to the back side of each of the die cuts. This will hold them in place while I stamp. Once you finish stamping, you can simply rub the adhesive off the back of the die cut. This is a great alternative to magnets, especially when the stamp is larger than the paper, such as these butterfly die cuts. Before I stamped the image, I rubbed over the paper using an anti-static pouch, and yes, I keep mine in an old Altoid tin. I like to use this to prevent stray embossing powder from sticking where I don't want it. I then applied an embossing ink to the stamp and stamped the image, applying even pressure using the LDRS Stampendable stamping tool. I love using this to apply pressure, especially when working with larger stamps, instead of pushing through my fingers. As I'm getting older, I'm trying to be more cautious of putting repeated pressure through my fingers, and this has been super helpful. With the stamping completed, I removed the die cuts and placed them onto a piece of typing paper, and then poured clear embossing powder over them, tapped off the excess, and returned it to the jar. I then used a pair of tweezers to hold each of the die cuts as I heat embossed them using a heat gun. Heat embossing was one of the first card making techniques I learned nearly 20 years ago, and I still absolutely love watching the powder transform and become shiny. It's like a magic trick that never gets old. Once the embossing was finished, I used Distress Collage Medium to adhere the bodies to each of the butterflies. Now it's time to add the pops of dots. Here I'm using scrapbook.com pops of color to add dots of color to each of the butterfly wings. I always like to do a practice squeeze with each bottle before I start working with the pops of color to make sure the medium is ready to come out of the bottle nice and even. I then started applying small little dots around the outside edge of each butterfly. On these butterflies, I'm using pops of color gloss in Sky Blue, Summer Peach, and Soft Lavender. I then set these to the side to dry and to start working on the rest of my card. For the background, I took a piece of Distress Watercolor and used the ink smushing technique to add some color to it. I smushed old paper and vintage photo distress ink pads directly onto my craft mat, spritzed them with some water using my distress sprayer, and then smushed my paper into the ink. I used my heat tool to dry the paper and then smushed the paper back onto my craft mat to pick up some of the remaining ink. I then dried the paper again. You can repeat this process until you are happy with the look of your paper. After I had inked the paper in this manner, I wanted to add some stamping using this script stamp from the Holtz Entomology stamp set. I once again used the temporary dotted adhesive roller to adhere my paper inside my MISTI. I then inked the stamp with vintage photo archival ink and stamped the image using the LDRS Stampendable tool to help me apply the pressure. Next, I spritzed the paper with water using my distress sprayer. I then began drying it using my heat tool. I also used a paper towel to dry and lift off some of the ink, and then finished off the drying with my heat tool. For another touch of interest, I tore off the paper along the left-hand side and then inked the edges with some vintage photo distress ink. I also used the back side of my scissor to distress the torn edge a bit more. I was going to mat the photo using the patterned paper you see here, but later changed my mind and replaced it with a piece of solid colored cardstock. For the sentiment, I used this cute stamp set from scrapbook.com. You might notice that I rubbed the palm of my hand over the stamp before I used it. I did this because this was a new and never before used stamp. This helps remove any oils from the manufacturing process and will give you a nice crisp stamped image. I used VersaFine pigment ink and onyx to stamp the sentiment because it won't stain clear stamps like archival ink will. To trim the sentiment into a strip, I used my paper trimmer to trim off some of the excess. I then placed the remaining piece into a scrap of paper with a piece of mint tape attached to it. I then placed the piece into my paper trimmer, lined up the bottom of the letters with the plastic guide on the trimmer, and removed the excess paper. I flipped the paper over and repeated this process and then trimmed off the edges. It wasn't quite even, so I trimmed off just a tiny bit more. That is one thing I love about this paper trimmer. You can trim off the tiniest sliver of paper. I then finished it off by adding a bit of vintage photo distress ink to the edge of the strip. When it came time to adding the other die cuts, I did quite a bit of futzing around with their placement. I ended up trimming them apart and at first thought that might be enough. In the end, I die cut another one of the sprigs from the die set and lightly inked it with the Mowed Lawn Distress Oxide ink. Then with a bit more futzing, I finally settled on the placement of the sprigs and butterflies. I used some double-sided foam adhesive strips to adhere the butterflies to the one sprig, and then tucked the other pieces behind and adhered them with Distress Collage Medium. I then finished off the card by adhering the sentiment using the foam adhesive strips. At this point is when I decided to replace the background paper with a piece of coordinating cardstock from the scrapbook.com floral paper pad. These are so perfect for layering, and this color coordinated perfectly with the saltwater taffy Distress Oxide and Summer Peach pops of color. To adhere the layers, I use scrapbook.com's permanent refillable adhesive roller. I like to apply one strip of adhesive to one edge of the paper, line up and center the opposite end with the bottom layer, flip it over, and add more adhesive. This is a great way to center the top and bottom layers before fully committing to adhering them. And there you have it, card number 1 is complete. Now on to the second card. On this card, I'm going to use the scrapbook.com Spring Floral Stencil with Distress Oxide inks and Saltwater Taffy, Salvage Patina, and Mowed Lawn. Once again, I'm using some pops of color, but one a little darker this time, using Coral Sunset, Turquoise Waters, and Olive. I adhered the stencil to a piece of distressed watercolor paper using mint tape. I then began applying the ink using a sponge dauber or a detail blending tool. I inked all of the butterflies using salvage patina. I used mowed lawn on the leaves and saltwater taffy on the flowers, except for a couple of flowers that I added salvage patina to just to get a bit more of this color on the design. As you can see, I tended to use the sponge dauber for the larger openings and the detail blender for the smaller spots where the sponge dauber was too big. I also like to apply the ink using a twisting motion, as I find this gets the ink into the corners of the stencil a bit better. After I had finished stenciling the image, I spritzed it with some water using my distress sprayer to give it a lightly distressed look. I dabbed it with a paper towel to remove some of the ink and then dried it with my heat tool. Next, I went about adding dots of pops of color to the various stenciled images. I used the same technique as on the first card, making sure to do a test dot or two off to the side before I began adding them to the card. As I mentioned earlier, I used turquoise waters, coral sunset, and olive pops of color. I hadn't used the olive one yet, so I had to remove the little red stopper that is in place to prevent the contents from leaking during shipping. Once I did that, I was back in business. For the sentiment on this card, I used the same stamp set I used on my first card. This time I stamped it using Distress Oxide and Salvage Patina and trimmed it using my paper trimmer and the same technique as on the first card. To embellish this card, I die cut 2 butterflies from vellum using the Tim Holtz Detail Butterflies dies. I used my sewing machine to stitch them together, but you could certainly skip this step and adhere them using an adhesive of your choice. I then adhered the sentiment to the center of the butterfly. For a bit more texture, I added some sewing machine stitching around the outside edge of the card panel. Next, I applied some vintage photo distress ink to the edges of the card panel to grunge it up just a tiny bit. I always like to mat my card panels, and on this card I found a couple of colors that coordinated perfectly from the scrapbook.com Sherbet paper pad. I ultimately ended up selecting the brighter green color and adhered it using scrapbook.com permanent refillable adhesive roller. I still wasn't quite happy with the card, so I decided to add a bit of stamping to it. I used this script stamp image from the Tim Holtz Dearly Departed stamp set. I didn't want it to be a stark image, so I applied old paper distress ink to my craft mat and then picked up the ink with a stamp before stamping the image onto my paper. To keep the stamp from getting onto the green mat, I placed a piece of adhesive liner underneath the top panel. This liner is from a package of scrapbook.com double-sided adhesive sheets, but you can save these from any sort of sticker or adhesive packaging. Once again, I thought I was finished, but after setting the card to the side and looking at it again later, I decided to add some turquoise waters pops of color to the vellum butterfly. I also added a bit of white sewing thread behind it and used scrapbook.com's permanent refillable adhesive roller to tack it in place. With these final touches, card number 2 was completed. Now, if you're still with me, card number 3 goes off on its own little tangent. I am not going to be using pops of color on this card to do any kind of dots. I have been wanting to try mixing pops of color with texture paste transparent gloss to see if it would work with the stencil and keep the shiny look of the pops of color. For this card, I'm using the scrapbook.com Little Boxes stencil. The pops of color I'm using is turquoise waters. I began with a piece of distressed watercolor paper and used some mint tape to hold the stencil in place. I then began with a bit of the turquoise waters, pops of color, and added in a little bit of the transparent gloss paste. I started mixing them together using my palette knife. The paste does seem to separate a bit, but I kept mixing and then added in more of the pops of color and then a bit more of the paste until I had enough to cover the paper. I actually made way more than I needed for one card and ended up making 2 card panels with it. I also wanted to share that the Texture Paste Transparent Gloss seems to be the same thing as the newly released Distress Texture Paste Translucent from Tim Holtz. After I had finished applying the colored paste, I removed the stencil and set the paper to the side to dry. On this next part, I'm going to be using the Tim Holtz Abstract Faces and Detailed Butterfly dies, the Sherbet paper pad from scrapbook.com, and some double-sided adhesive sheets. I applied the adhesive sheets to the back side of the lighter blue paper and trimmed off the excess. I then die cut some of the scribbly shapes using my die cutting machine. I also die cut one of the solid butterflies from the darker blue paper. Using a craft pick, I removed the liner from the adhesive and adhered the scribbly die cuts to the butterfly. I then took a pair of scissors and trimmed off the overhanging parts of the die cut. Now it's time to go back to the background paper. I smushed some saltwater taffy distress ink onto my craft mat, spritzed it with some water, and then used a paintbrush to splatter it onto the paper. I actually started splattering before I realized that I wasn't recording this part, so I added some more splatters so you could see that process. If you shake the brush, you will get the larger droplets, and if you tap the brush with your finger, you will get the smaller splatters. I then used my heat tool to dry the splatters, and then repeated the splattering process using some Mowed Lawn distress ink. To add more interest to the card, I used the script stamp from the Tim Holtz Dearly Departed stamp set, applying the same technique I used on my second card. I smushed the old paper distress ink pad onto my craft mat, pushed the stamp into the ink, stamped the image onto my card, and repeated this process over the card panel. I then dried the ink with my heat tool. I wanted to grunge things up a little bit, so I also inked the edges of the card panel and the die cuts with Vintage Photo Distress ink. As I went to edit this video, I realized that I had somehow recorded my image in slow-mo and the lights were flickering. I tried several things to improve the video quality with no luck, so I decided to eliminate that part of my video. The part I'm not showing is how much time I spent futzing around with the placement of the die cuts. Once I had that figured out, I adhered them with Distress Collage Medium and added a sentiment from the Tim Holtz metallic sticker book. I then finished off the card by matting it onto the same piece of blue paper I used to die cut the blue butterfly. I tried my best to show you the shine from the transparent gloss paste and pops of color, but I wasn't able to really catch it. It is there though, I promise, and I think it will show up more with a stencil that has a slightly larger opening in the design. Thanks for watching. I sure hope you enjoyed seeing some new ideas for adding scrapbook.com's pops of color to your next card project. I also can't wait to do more stenciling with the transparent gloss paste in the near future. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.